ITSE Australia and New Zealand, I'm not sure why we were invited to give a talk about this, but once we started thinking about it, it became clear to us that Australia and New Zealand make a disproportionate contribution to ITSE, disproportionate to their very small populations. So we took up the challenge and decided that we could tell you something about the computing education community, which of course you probably already know. We can talk about Australia and New Zealand and their contribution to that community. We can talk about ITSE as an international forum for computing education. Now that's really annoying. That's going to keep happening because I changed screens. And we can talk about the future of ITSE as an international conference, which is a pretty important thing to talk about.
Okay, so some of you may not know where Australia and New Zealand are. So we have a map here of the world, and when Simon, yes, here they are at the top. We've got New Zealand on the left and Australia on the right. But perhaps this might be more familiar. So here we are. You might be more familiar at looking at a map like this. So here we are in the Southern Hemisphere. So how do we describe these two countries? So I found some quotes from Mark Twain, who visited Australia and New Zealand in 1895, and he wrote a book called Following the Equator about his travels. And he said of Australia, "Nature is always stingy of perfect climates, stingier in the case of Australia, more than usual. Apparently this vast continent has really good climate nowhere but round the edges." So with Australia, of course, most people live in the southeast of the country, and there's a vast area where there's not much other than desert. But of New Zealand, okay, so he went to New Zealand as well. So all people think that New Zealand is close to Australia, or that you cross it on a bridge. But that is not so. It's not close to anything, but lies by itself out in the water. It's nearest to Australia, but still not near. The gap between it is very wide. It will be a surprise to the reader, as it was to me, to learn that the distance from Australia to New Zealand is really 12 or 1,300 miles, and there is no bridge. So perhaps not in distance, but Australia and New Zealand are close in many ways. We share a colonial background. Our flags are very similar. We have the same language, but perhaps not the same accent. There is often confusion when we talk to each other about peer assessment and pair programming. Those words sound different to us. Currently, in COVID times, there's talk of a travel bubble between the two countries. So another indication of our closeness, about 15 years ago, we formed the Australasian chapter of SIGSI, and this was the first SIGSI chapter. So here's this bridge idea again. In 2015, there was an article in a Sydney newspaper which proposed that the addition of 5 million New Zealanders to this is Australia's 24 million, would bring great strength and build on our natural advantages. So that was the idea of the bridge.
However, we do need to take another look at this cartoon,
yeah,
which shows that...
the cartoon shows New Zealand creeping away from Australia when there's the thought of a bridge being built. But also the title there, Australasian. Now, The Australasia is often used when referring to both Australia and New Zealand, and that's what we'll use in our presentation. It's a bit unfortunate because it seems to be Australia, but it actually Australasia encompasses New Zealand, but it doesn't sound much like New Zealand. So that's just to explain that.
Okay, we've got one more map, and this one I find very exciting. This is a map that Judy sometimes uses when she's talking internationally, just so that she can show people where Melbourne is. So she points to Melbourne down here, and everyone says, oh, that's where Melbourne is. It's not in Sydney. But I looked at this map and I thought, wow, there is so much that's interesting about this map. It's published in the United States, which means it's not really surprising that they didn't get all the spellings right. So there is no place called Launceston. It's actually called Launceston. But the other beautiful thing about this map, and we will relate it back to computing, the other beautiful thing about this map is that it is a brilliant illustration of the map maker's sense of what is right in a map. And what is not right in a map is big empty spaces. And Australia has big empty spaces. Most of Australia's population lives on the coast. And in fact, they've done such a good job on the coast that there's some places they simply couldn't fit in. Like the red dot you now see down there is the city of Wollongong, which has 250,000 people. And there's a couple more red dots. Ballarat and Bendigo have about 118,000 and 115,000 people. And they couldn't fit those in because, you know, there were other places in the way. But they couldn't bear the thought of that empty interior. And it turns out that in the interior, I have found 20 places with populations of less than 10,000, even though they've left out places with 250,000. 10 of those places that are on this map have populations under 1,000. And I really want to draw attention to 3 of them: Culgera, Larimar, and Baladonia. And I'm going to show you pictures of Culgera, Larimar, and Baladonia. Here is a picture of Culgera. At the last census, it had a population of 50 people. Here is Larimar. It had a population of 47 people. And here is Baladonia. It had a population of 5 people. Now, all right, that's about map makers, but it's about more than map makers. It's also something that we really need to know about as computing educators, because what have those map makers done? They have let their beliefs about what makes a proper map interfere with an accurate presentation of the data. And that's something we need to teach our students to be very wary about. For example, and just plucking an example out of thin air, just because a programmer has never met anyone who has only one name, that programmer shouldn't insist that therefore everybody has at least 2 names. And yet many programmers do insist that. So there is a lesson in the map maker's mistake, which leads to the computer scientist's mistake as well. Judy.
Okay, so Australasia's place in the global community. Well, when we look at that map, one of the early maps, we see it, Australia and New Zealand look like outliers because we're geographically remote. We have small populations, 26 million and 5 million. We're in a different hemisphere to Europe, North America, and much of Asia. But we're still a big part of the global computing community. So what do Australia and New Zealand bring to the international computing community? Now, what we're going to do is give you some examples of how we've contributed, how this little area, the south part of the globe, are contributing to computing. So what you see here is a piece of history. Now, this is CIRAC. Now, it was the 4th stored program computer in the world, and it was built in Australia. It was built in Sydney, but ended up in Melbourne. So the person in the picture is Dr. Trevor Pearcey, and he was one of the designers of CIRAC, and he was at one stage a dean at my university. So it's the oldest stored program computer still in existence, and perhaps it's the only intact first-generation computer. So it used 32 mercury delay lines and 2,000 valves, and input and output was via paper tape, and the programming language was machine code. So it was built in 1949. It ran its first, well, it was built a few years before that, but ran its first program in 1949, just a few months after the Manchester baby ran the first program. So that's a significant artefact in the history of computing.
Now we move to communication, and this is a picture of the Parkes radio dish. It's a 64-metre radio dish, and you can see that in this picture they've made a point of including the moon as well. And the reason they've done that is that with the moon landings in Apollo 11, 1969, the time of the actual landing and the time of the first steps on the moon were such that they couldn't be picked up by radio telescopes in the northern hemisphere. So the video signal of the first steps on the moon was actually from an Australian telescope. Not this one, as it happens. It was a smaller one at a place called Honeysuckle Creek, because the moon hadn't quite risen at Parkes. But as soon as the moon rose at Parkes, it carried on broadcasting the images, and many of the images of the first moon landings, and indeed the subsequent moon landings, were relayed to the world from Parkes and the dish.
Okay, so I'm sure many of you have heard of Rupert Murdoch. Now, he's an Australian-born American media mogul who founded News Corp. So he inherited his father's publishing company in 1952, which was already a substantial operation. He built the company up, acquiring newspapers in Australia, New Zealand, then expanded to the United Kingdom, and then eventually the US. So in 1985, he became a naturalised US citizen, giving up his Australian citizenship. So the relationship to computing. Okay, so in 1986, Murdoch was keen to adopt new electronic publishing technologies. So he consolidated his UK printing operations in London, and this caused bitter industrial disputes. So Murdoch wanted to introduce technological innovations that would put 90% of the old-fashioned typesetters out of work. So the company offered redundancy payments to each printer to quit their jobs, and the union rejected the offer, and then there was a strike with 6,000 members at Murdoch's papers on strike. Okay, so meanwhile, his paper, News International, had built and clandestinely equipped a new printing plant in the London district of Wapping. So he really forged into the computing age, and it was quite a disruptive time in publishing. So that's Rupert Murdoch. Okay, now another Australian I'm sure you've heard of is Julian Assange. So he's an editor, publisher, activist, founder of WikiLeaks in 2006. So currently he's in jail in London fighting extradition to the US. But perhaps you don't know that at the age of 16, he was into computers. He began a career as a hacker, and with two others formed a hacking group called the International Subversives. And he's thought to have been involved in the Worms Against Nuclear Killers back at hacking into NASA in 1989, but he doesn't admit to this. But he was discovered hacking into the Melbourne master terminal of Nortel, a multinational telecommunications corporation. So that's another Australian contribution to the world of computing.
Now, look, we've had a couple of Australian contributions. We don't want New Zealand to feel left out. And I'm watching Andrew's face as I click to the next slide. Thank you, Andrew. This is a gentleman called Kim.com. He used to be called Kim Schmitz, but he changed his name to Kim.com because he made so much money out of his .com entrepreneurship, which consisted mainly, I mean, he did lots of other things, but his main contribution was creating a site called Mega Upload that people could use to swap perhaps not completely legitimately acquired videos and music and so on. And a lot of people did a lot of uploading and downloading, and Kim.com and his partners made a lot of money. And Hollywood got very, very annoyed because all of its copyright was being breached. In about 2010, I think it was, Kim.com was granted permanent residence in New Zealand. And I haven't seen why he chose to go to New Zealand, but one might guess because almost ever since then, probably since about 2012, he has been fighting extradition to the US, just as Julian Assange is fighting extradition to the US. The US seems to want to get a lot of people that have annoyed it. And so one of New Zealand's contributions, not quite the same as Julian Assange, but definitely on the same page, is our friend Kim.com. Let's go back to space. This is an artist's impression of a thing called the Square Kilometre Array. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Square Kilometre Array, but it is a highly ambitious plan, it's still a plan at this stage, for a massive radio telescope. Now, one of the things about radio telescopes is if you have multiple dishes spaced appropriately, your effect is as if you had a dish the size of the spacing. But these are actually going to be all over a large area of Australia and a large area of South Africa. The square kilometre bit is the actual area of radio dish, not the area between the dishes, not the area the dishes sit in, but there will actually be a square kilometre of radio dish, which will give an instrument 50 times more sensitive than any that they've had so far. But the astonishing thing about the square kilometre array when it comes to computing is that the communication links it is going to need to relay all the data it gathers will be transmitting as much information as the internet currently transmits, the whole of the internet. And the amount of data that this radio telescope will generate per second is the same as the amount of data in the world today. So for computing, there's going to have to be a lot of advance in how we communicate data and how we process data if this array is to be of any use at all. There is a lot of future for computing in the square kilometre array. Judy.
So we've talked a bit about community, and we've talked a bit about the contributions that Australia and New Zealand have made to the computing community. So what is this concept of community? We'll be talking a bit about the computing education community. So let's think about what community means. So a definition I found was a complex structure of interrelationships that are based on shared goals and mutual needs. The three elements that are commonly talked about when we talk about community are common interests, common communal bonds, shared space or place. So with the developments in communication information technologies, there have been huge changes in the way people communicate, they share resources, they work together. So this has changed the way communities form and are sustained. So we're no longer restricted to a physical place. Communities now develop in online space. And so this is really relevant to our conference. We've moved our IDSE community from a physical meeting to an online meeting. So communities grow and are sustained by people contributing. So there are many ways to contribute. People can give their different perspectives, share experiences, collaborations, organising events, hosting visitors, etc. So they bring knowledge of a different context. So do we have a computing education community? Well, thinking about the three elements I talked of before, common interests, yes, computing education, and we're extending that. I think we're interested in our students learning, computing education for a purpose, to help our students learn, to teach better. Communal bonds, we've got collaborations, we've got projects, publications, committees, working groups, lots of activities that form, where we form these bonds. Shared place or space, yes, conferences, physical, now online, and we've got forums. So there are many connections in the computing education community. So this is just what I can get from my system at work, my research profile at work. And it's kind of crazy. It's got lots of people, but it shows you just that's just my connections with the community. Of course, all these people have got similar connections. So I connect to people in my own institution, other institutions, and internationally. So the computing education community is quite a complex thing.
Yeah, I see. Just looking at that, I see people in the UK, I see people in the US, I see people in Finland. I see, yeah, you've
Ireland, got... Yeah,
Mm.
Yeah, many people, yeah, locally, internationally, yeah. So it's even Simon there.
Several times, I think. It's a strange algorithm. Okay, so why is it important to know whether we have a computing education community? What does a computing education community do for its members? Well, it provides opportunities for sharing knowledge, for sharing resources, for sharing innovations. It provides opportunities for networking and collaborations, as some of us saw when we were in the Lean Coffee session just before this session, for trialing ideas and innovations in new contexts. We are very good at trialing ideas and innovations in our own context, but how do we really know they work until we try them in other contexts as well? And we can get other members of the community to do that, for having multi-institutional projects. And of course, all of this is better if we can actually make it an international community and not just within one nation. So here is something from Joe Mirohulia and his co-authors in an ISA paper in 2012. Real advances in education theory are those that work globally, We must look beyond our classrooms if we want to find robust teaching methods and prove their validity. And that's something that we can do far more readily if we have a computing education community. There's also the international perspective. All right, the word growing is perhaps a long-term rather than a short-term. Growing movement of students globally, well, right at the moment, everyone seems to be frozen. In Australia and New Zealand, we have high numbers of international students, and I know we are not the only countries that have high numbers of international students. So it's important to be able to understand the educational context from which they come and the cultural context from which they come and the context in which they will be working if they return to their countries. And the international community helps us to understand these things. Also, of course, the international community helps to establish international connections, and our institutions tend to value international connections.
Okay, so Australasia is a big contributor to the international computing education community. So here are some statistics to take in. Now, the first is some work that Andrew Luxon-Riley did in 2019, not published, but just some work that he shared. At that time, the top computing education authors in the ACM Digital Library, if you order them by number of papers, 6 out of the top 20 are from Australasia. 2 are in the top 4. So ordered by number of citations, 5 of the 20 are from Australasia. So considering the small population, we really think we're punching above our weight here. So when we look at working groups, now 25 of the ITSE working groups, and we've had 130 odd, have been led or co-led by someone from Australasia. 40%, and I think it's probably a little more than 40%, have had Australasian participation. Now there was a working group in 2004 led by Ray Lister from Australia, and that in 2004, that was the only working group that happened that year. And it was a time when people were worried that working groups were going to die out. Of course, that didn't happen, and they've gone from strength to strength. But this working group did some great work on looking at the reading and tracing skills in novice programmers. And in the Google Scholar, it has just last week 561 citations. So a huge effort. So that's another Australasian contribution. So now this is looking at the working groups with Australasian leaders or co-leaders. From the start of ITSE, so for the first couple of years we didn't have any, and then we had one that was co-led by someone from Australasia, and then one for every so often. But have a look at the last 8 years. We've had every year leaders from Australasia in working groups, and in a couple of years, 2017, 2019, 5 working groups were led by people from Australasia. Now, this I think shows the breadth of work and the potential impact on computing education research from this region. McCartney and Sanders, in their analysis of collaboration networks of ITSE, they looked at working groups and found that working groups play a really important role in integrating newcomers into the community. People that join working groups tend to stay in the community. So people that lead working groups and do all that work to lead the group and produce the paper, they're giving an important contribution to the community. So here are just some of the working groups, or the leaders of working groups, the leaders from Australasia of working groups, and the topics what they've covered. We've had a few people that have looked at introductory programming, the distance learning, capstone projects, academic integrity, and so we go on. And this isn't a complete list. This is most of them, but not absolutely complete. So there are others as well. So I think this really shows the breadth of the work and breadth of the contributions from Australasia.
Here's another way of showing the internationalism of the ITSE community. Now, this is from a paper that I'll be presenting later at this conference. It's the links between authors from various regions. So you can look, for example, at the United Kingdom has 230 authors in ITSE papers over the 24 years. Australasia, with a much smaller population, 217. The biggest contribution comes from USA and Canada combined, and a pretty hefty contribution from Europe. And what we notice is the thickness of the lines joining these, which means it's not just there's a lot of authors from Australasia and there's a lot of authors from Europe. There are a lot of papers that have authors from Australasia and from Europe. There are a lot of papers that have authors from Australasia and North America, and so on. So this is a very nice illustration of the international nature of the ITSE community. And yet, getting back to ITSE, Australia and New Zealand, what's the story? We have to tell you it's not easy for people in Australia and New Zealand to be part of the ITSE community. Typically, to get from home to ITSE, we will have to travel at least 40 hours. That's a lot of travel, and of course it's a lot of money as well. And when we have that travel, we're exposed to an almost complete time shift. So our day becomes night and our night becomes day. Not only that, but the seasons are reversed. You people can't begin to imagine how it, let's say it mildly irks us when we read so many papers that talk about things happening in the fall semester and the spring semester. And we think, okay, you mean the Northern Hemisphere autumn or the Northern Hemisphere spring. But you know, we have those in the opposite time of year. The academic year itself is therefore out of phase as well, because our summer corresponds to your winter. Then our long summer holiday is the one that happens around Christmas and New Year, whereas your long summer holiday is just about to get started. And of course, in terms of physical contact, it's difficult to have contact with the rest of the community. And even when it comes to online contact, it can be a little difficult finding suitable times for everyone to meet. On the other hand, there are some benefits. Because ITSE is generally in our winter break, it's more suitable for us than the SIGSE Technical Symposium, which is typically at the beginning of an academic year, just in the first week or two. And it's very hard to get away to go to the Technical Symposium, whereas it tends to be easier to get away to go to ITSE. And the other thing which I really like is that the summer break is the December-January break, and the ITSE deadline is typically mid-January. So if we've done the data gathering, we have lots of time free to work on analysis and writing. Except that I must here give a nod to my colleagues in Northern Europe and say, look, I know what summer break means to you. Summer break seems to mean in Northern Europe, everything stops. You don't do any work, you go hiking and you go boating and you go and stay in the country and that sort of thing. Yeah, it's not always like that. So if we're going to be working on our ITISI papers over Christmas, New Year, we are giving up our summer break, but we reckon it's worth it. Now, because of COVID and when it struck and how it struck, the ACM hurriedly put out a report on virtual conferences. And here are some of the things it said. Pardon me. There's been an increasing interest by many members of the ACM community in ways to support remote participation in conferences. They're talking about ways to organize online and mixed events. But they're also talking about community awareness towards environmental sustainability and climate change, diversity, inclusion, and economic justice. Now, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to this report because it seems to be saying, look, we had to go online and we had to go online in a hurry, but there might be good reasons to consider staying online, or at least partly online. And Judy's going to talk to us a bit more about some of these points: environmental sustainability, climate change, diversity, inclusion, and economic justice.
So there's this move to online, the sudden move to online conferences has sparked some discussion about online communities and is it a problem? Are online communities more difficult than physical communities? But there is arguments that online communities need not be what Fernbach has termed diluted communities, that you can have relationships that are mediated by technology that can be meaningful, and online communities can exist effectively. So when we move to online space rather than place, we can have communities. The important thing about communities is that you have this collective sense of community, which is a feeling that members have of belonging and a feeling that members matter to one another and to the group, and that their needs will be met through their commitment to be together. So these are all very, very relevant issues at the moment, especially with the environment that we're in.
So we are running over time, so Judy's going to rush through this one.
Challenges for the future. Of course, we've got pandemics. We've got one at the moment. We've got climate change. It's not only the travel may be difficult, expensive. People don't want to do it as much as they did before because of the feeling of what it's doing to the environment. Conference funding is becoming scarce in some places. There's a pressure to publish in journals rather than go to conferences, rather than publishing conferences. So these are all challenges for the future, and it's really a time of disruption. So further challenges. The data that Simon showed before with his network diagram, if we look at the participation, ITISI participation, and we look at the continents, we've got 90% of the participation coming from Europe and UK. We've got UK separate to Europe and the US, and Australasia only 6% from Asia, Africa, the three continents of Asia, Africa, and South America. So there's a huge imbalance in participation in literacy. So what about these other communities? Should we be reaching out to these other communities to join literacy? Is it truly an international conference? We've managed to do it from Australasia, but the situation in Australasia is quite different to some of these other places that we're looking at.
Now, I want to talk to you briefly about Yevgeny Yeremin, who some of you might know. I met him at a conference in Coley, and those of you who've been to Coley Calling will know and love this conference. I've been there quite a few times, and I met Yevgeny there. Yevgeny comes from Perm, over here in Russia, a long way into Russia. Look, here is Moscow. Yevgeny comes from Perm, and when he travels to a conference, he is funded for rail travel within Russia. So why does he go to the conference in Coley? Because he can spend several days on a train traveling through Moscow, up through St. Petersburg, and up to a town whose name I've forgotten, just the other side of the border from Coley. And then out of his own pocket, he can pay to get on a bus and be taken across to this conference. And then after the conference, he pops back over the border and spends several days on a train traveling back to Perm. And when I looked more into what Yevgeny had done, I found that in 2000, I think it was 2000, the year that ITISI was in Helsinki, he produced a poster for the Helsinki ITISI as well, obviously using the same technique, funded to travel all the way to St. Petersburg, and then funding himself to get from there to Helsinki. And I think that tells us partly that he's dedicated to getting to these international conferences, but also that he is one of many people who can't simply get funding to go to international conferences. And these are the people that we need to be working to help. So what is ITISI's role in supporting the international computing education community? What can ITISI do to involve people from these countries with low participation? Could we sponsor places for people from underrepresented areas? Could we say, even when COVID is over, there will be some opportunity for virtual attendance, some kind of support for virtual attendance? ITISI has a great past. It has a fantastic present. I mean, ITISI this year is just wonderful. But we do need to ask ourselves how ITISI will move into the future. That's us.
That's it.
You may all applaud. Sorry for running a little over time.
Thank you very much, Simon and Judy, for a very interesting presentation here. We now can open this up to questions. So if you've got a question, please type it into the question and answer. Those of you that need a bathroom break or need to grab some coffee or something could hang around for questions, or you could leave now and we won't know. And so while we wait for questions to come in, you posed some very interesting challenges at the end, in the very last slide. Did you have any suggestions as to answers for those challenges?
Sorry, I was just reading Corey Bart's question and answer. Are we really not going to talk about how that Rupert Murdoch's heinous actions in supporting political propaganda? Yeah, we're not. But we'll acknowledge your question.
Yes.
Do we have any answers, any proposed answers for those questions? Look, we have answers that we might like to see, but we don't know how they might be implemented. For example, a fully online ITSE is going to work. Due to the phenomenal efforts of a lot of people, this is going to be a great conference. But if we were to have a partly physical, partly online conference, how much more effort would that take to manage? Every presentation would presumably have to be streamed as well as being run in the physical location. One would have to say, how do we decide who gets to pay the full fee and to attend in person? And is it somehow cheating to pay a reduced fee and attend virtually? We don't know the answers to these questions. And I don't think ITSE knows the answers to these questions. But I think they are questions that must definitely be contemplated.
There is one comment from Laurie that I was also thinking about that. When it comes to your analysis that you kind of detached UK from the rest of the Europe, I hope we in Norway we're not part of the union as well. So I hope you don't try to put us out of the continent as well.
Well,
I can explain that because one of those diagrams, the network diagram, came from me, and it was essentially because the UK had contributed so many more papers than any other country in Europe. And so it was worth singling out as a big contributor. There was no intention to say the UK is not part of Europe, although I think there might be some wording in the paper that says maybe this will need to be rethought in the next couple of years.
Yeah, because if you put together UK and Europe in your analysis, it goes above the North America. That's why it's a little bit interesting, but yeah.
Correct.
yeah.
Correct.
Yes, we could have. Yes, someone pointed that out. Yes, that's quite true. Yes. Maybe it was about the time of Brexit that we were doing it too. There's a question from Norman Lee. How does a newcomer join a working group? Well, you apply. When the working groups are advertised, you can apply to a working group. You look through the list that's advertised and you can apply to the leaders to join. And it's actually a great way of getting into the community, to meeting people and working with international colleagues. They're great experiences. And there are quite a few people around that have done multiple working groups and led multiple working groups. And they're growing in popularity because they are such good experiences. And the analysis that Robert McCartney and Kate Sanders did shows that it's a really great way of getting people involved in the community. So
there's a question there from somebody anonymous, but I think it merits an answer. I'm fascinated that you call ITSE an international forum for computing education. Is this really what the SIGC board see ITSE? Well, first of all, I have to say that this is Judy's and my perspective, and we don't pretend to speak for the SIGC board. What happened to ITSE being a European conference? I think we certainly intended to say at the beginning that ITSE is certainly a European-based conference. And we, however, from our perspective in Australia and probably in New Zealand, see Europe itself as international. It has many nations. countries. So even if it's a European conference, surely that doesn't stop it from being an international conference. I hope I haven't misunderstood your question.
My understanding is it's an international conference that is located in Europe. So the fact that it doesn't travel around the world doesn't mean it's not an international conference. It's actually based in Europe, but has international people. Yes.
Since we are talking in the Australasian context, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that ETC is probably the only computing education research conference that ranks Era A in the ranking you have in Australia, and this might be another reason why a lot of Australia participate.
Ranks A. The technical symposium also has an A ranking. And we've at my institution, I've managed to argue for ISA being ranked A as well. Yeah.
So there is a comment also about the networking diagram when it comes to the collaboration links. So the percentage of authors that are, well, which countries collaborate with which other countries, I suppose. So authors coming from, for instance, from Australia might participate very much from people coming from North Europe or the UK or US. Such an analysis might also be very insightful, I guess.
I think that comment is also pointing out that the size of each circle, although on that slide the circles have become ovals, but the size of each circle is proportional to the number of authors in that geographic grouping, and the thickness of each line is proportional to the number of authors collaborating, but there's no clear relationship between the number of authors in the line thickness and the number of authors in the circle diameter. So they are effectively two separate things. And yes, I agree with the comment, it would be interesting to show the proportion, to show the quantitative link between the thickness of a line and the size of a circle. It's a good point. Somebody else is asking what's the share of US versus Canada. I don't actually remember, but certainly the US contributes far more than Canada overall.
So there's an interesting question there from Jack Parkinson asking, how might we tap into these underrepresented communities? What could we be doing to reach out to those communities if people are not specifically present at ETC?
Maybe online it's going to be easier for people to be involved if they don't have the travel expense. So I think a lot of it is the travel expense. And people can't afford to travel.
Travel and accommodation.
And accommodation as well, yeah. So maybe there's an opportunity now to really try and involve other people from countries that were prohibited before by the travel expense.